This is Ayesha Akhtar, Director of Education with the Epilepsy Foundation of Greater Chicago. And as you see with me, I have today Patti Ogden. She's a certified nurse practitioner with the University of Chicago Comer Children's Hospital. So welcome, Patti.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. And Patti and I, you and I have worked together for so many years doing seizure education. You've come out to Camp Black Hawk so many times, to the Bounds Out the Stigma camp. You've been a friend of the organization. You've run on our marathon team. You're really someone that I like to go to when I like to do seizure education for parents. So I thought today it'd be a great opportunity for us to have that dialogue virtually,
Sure.
so we can share this with our Facebook world.
All right, then.
So I thought we'd just kind of go through a very high level on seizure first aid and epilepsy and talking about rescue medications as well. So I was thinking, like, let's just start by just defining seizures. I can just define that, and then you can talk about some of the stats. You can talk about defining epilepsy, what your patients see, and then we can also focus on some rescue medications and first aid.
All right. Sounds like a plan.
Great, great. So I always like to start every time I go into a classroom with, the shared understanding of what a seizure is. And I have found an analogy that I really like that I think people really understand very well. And it's basically the understanding the brain. And, everyone has a cell phone now. Everyone has been in a situation where you've tried to send or receive a message. Like, I'm sure, Patti, you've done the same thing. You've tried to send a message in a crowded area. What happens to your message?
Well, there's a static, or sometimes there's a pause. Sometimes it's hard to connect.
Right. That pause, the delay, it causes communication breakdown. So in the brain, we have millions of neurons that are transmitting electrical signals all day, every day, much like the way a cell phone would be transmitting signals. So what do you think happens in the brain at the time we have that sort of juncture where there's too many neurons or there's a cross-firing of neurons? What happens in the brain at that time?
So, well, many things, different things can happen, to different people. I mean, if we're talking for people, you can have a moment where you're just not there. People may call that a steering, or, people may start with, the word is automatisms, where they'll have lip chewing, or they'll want to, not squeeze their hands, but they'll want to move their hands, or and that's usually associated with like a focal, onset seizure. Or they'll start with the movement, whether it's the shaking or the stiffening, and some may even just drop, much like a cell phone. When you're in this area and you just lose your call, you just completely have a loss of complete tone. But different types of events can happen.
Right. Yeah. We always say there's a change in behavior and movement in the senses and awareness. And I think because of all of these different things, there's so many permutations. We say that there are about 20 plus seizure types, correct?
Yes.
But so having one single seizure is not epilepsy. In fact, 1 in 10 people will have a single seizure in their lifetime. Can you now define what epilepsy is?
The new International League Against Epilepsy's definition now is actually two-part. So part A is, what I tell my patients is when you have two seizures separated by more than 24 hours, that's not provoked. And, the 24 hours could be a month, it could be 6 months, it could be a year, but you have these two events that are not provoked by, by fever, for example. That's one definition of epilepsy. So if you have two, you've reached that definition. But now the second part of it is if you have one single seizure and the predisposition to have a second one. And that's what we define as having as epilepsy. Now, how do you define, what defines you or predisposes you to have a second seizure is, depending on your first one, whether we would get an EEG and you have abnormalities, epileptiform activities in the EEG, or again, depending on what your first single seizure looks like, we may get an MRI picture of your brain. And then if there is any structural abnormalities, then we would say, okay, you're at a predisposition to have a second seizure. We want to recommend starting you on anti-epileptic or anti-seizure medications.
Now, as we know, 1 in 26 people can develop epilepsy at some point in their lifetime. Can you talk a little bit about the different types of seizures? I know there's two different categories that we like to talk about, but just give people like a sense as to kind of like what the different types are and what they can look out for.
So again, the International League Against Epilepsy has now redefined what the seizure types are. And I'm having a moment here, but it's focal or non-focal, meaning I have to see, I'm actually thinking in my brain because I'm so accustomed to using what the older definitions are. So it's either, so focal is where you have the seizures that are occurring or the epileptic activity that's coming from one part of the brain that starts. And then you have your
Generalized.
right, and then you have your generalized, or where the seizure activity starts in both sides of the brain. Now, within focal seizures, you can have awareness where you are actually aware that you're having a seizure, or you can have loss of awareness where you're not, if someone's calling your name and you're not being, or you're not responsive. So it's in almost like part A, or one type that's broken down into two parts, and then you have your generalized seizure activity.
Right, right. And so when I go into classrooms, I usually talk about maybe 4 different seizure types just to kind of give teachers and staff a basic overview of things that they can look forward to in their classroom, if and when a seizure does occur. But a lot of that is based on information that comes from someone like you, where you're able to fill out the seizure action plan, working with the parent in conjunction to provide that information. So hopefully, by the time that that information reaches the school, the staff has a good idea to know what symptoms to look forward to. And then most importantly, is seizure first aid.
Every person that has a definition of epilepsy should have a seizure action plan.
Seizures in and of themselves are not going to be emergencies, but the lack of first aid is when we actually create an emergency situation. So what are your sort of top tips on seizure first aid?
Well, the first and foremost is not to panic. But any seizure first aid is so difficult, as a parent or a loved one or a caregiver who's watching your person, whether it's your child or your sister or your spouse having a seizure. I mean, I can't imagine what that's like. But my heart is just tightening up right now just thinking about it. But one of the first things you do is you panic and you have this sense of fear that happens when you have a seizure. And one of the first things that I tell you to do is so not natural, right? One, don't panic. The first thing. The second thing is you're going to go to that person, you're going to lay them on their side. And then the third thing is what's so unnatural is I'm going to ask you to time the seizure, right? Time. So, and then if it gets prolonged, that's when we instruct you or the person to call 911. And then the other thing now that we're actually asking our parents to do, because I primarily work with kids, is we actually have them take a video, which is also very not natural. I mean, because you want to provide care, and it's hard to say, okay, hold on, I'm going to stop for a moment. I want to take a video of my child having a seizure. But that is so helpful to us because we want to see what you see at home.
I agree. And that is something that school teachers say all the time as well, is that when they can actually see that video so they know what they're looking for, it takes the panic out, it takes that commotion out, and they're able to just calmly go up to the child and do exactly what they need to do, which is what you said, turn them over to their side. So let's talk now about some of the medications and rescue medications that are out there. I know you and I have talked about some of the new advancements, so I'd love for you to share some information about rescue meds.
All right, so the first medication that has been around for a very, very long time is the rectal diastat. It's an applicator that's already pre-dosed, so you don't have to worry about pre-dosing it. We tell you the dose to give. You give the prescription to the pharmacy locks the dose for you, and all you need to do is they have instructions in the kit, and then you insert the applicator in the rectum, and then it's designed to stop the seizure. Okay. Now what we tell parents is most times is that if you use the diastat and it stops the seizures, you don't need to go to the emergency room because you're actually treating, you're actually treating your child or treating your person. But oftentimes when you first use diastat, from when my parents first used diastat for the very first time, they still called 911, to get them evaluated, and that's perfectly okay to do. But I find that over time, as the child has subsequent seizures and they treat with diastat, and then the seizure stops and they feel comfortable taking care of the child at home without going to the emergency room. But that's been probably, diastat's been around for a very long time, but we're really excited that there's now new avenues of seizure rescue when you aren't in a situation where you can, it could be quite embarrassing to have to pull pants down to insert something, rectally. It could be considered very invasive. And especially for adolescents and young adults, they don't want that. They're like, no. So we've had to give oral medications. There's a wafer that will dissolve in the tongue, such as clonazepam. But we're really excited about the new intranasal rescue medicines that are now out and FDA approved for repetitive seizures. So that's very, very exciting.
Super exciting. And that's something that whenever I'm in the classroom and I get to this part of my training, there's almost applause in the classroom because they don't have to deal with diastat because, as you said, it's very uncomfortable. And I think the nasalam and the wafer kind of give the power back to the person as well, because I know that sometimes they can self-administer if they're at that age appropriate, and if the seizure is the type that allows them to do that. So that's definitely a huge advancement. Really excited about that. And that's something else I wanted to mention is that the EFGC can provide medical ID bracelets, and I know that that's something that we kind of live in a world where we don't want to touch people anymore, especially now in this pandemic era. We definitely are not going close to one another, but it's really important to take that first step and to check to see if there is a medical ID bracelet or some sort of tag. And so I just wanted to kind of give a shout out to EFGC that if anyone does need a medical ID bracelet or necklace, that we can provide that for your family for free. So that's something that's out there.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for reminding me, because sometimes I do forget, to tell the parent that this is a good time to have a medical ID bracelet when you have a medical condition, in the event that you're not at home and you happen to have the seizure when you're out and about. I am the roaming provider. I think I'm losing you, but I have clinics in Comer in Hyde Park. I also have a clinic in Maryville, Indiana, Orland Park, and now in St. Anthony's Hospital, just down the road from you guys.
Thank you so much for spending some time with me this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Ayesha, for having me.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.